Hey, welcome back to the Group Project podcast, episode number 44, the first episode after winter break here. And I'm excited. I have the Dr. Peter Dewitt with me. Dr. Dewitt, Peter, can I call you Peter? Is that okay?
Yeah, I usually just go by Peter, to be honest with you. So that's perfectly fine.
Well, Peter is joining us from upstate New York, Albany, correct?
That's right. You
Uh,
you say it like everybody outside of the state though. It's Albany. Like
oh,
even when I'm on planes, I hear people say Albany. No, and you're not even the first person today to say it that way. So
so Albany.
yeah, you know.
Okay. Well, you even said it for
Oh,
me correctly before the show and I messed it up.
I'm
So,
just busting on you. It's all right. Don't worry about it.
so Peter is a lifelong educator here. He was a teacher, K-5 teacher, was a principal, but a lot of people know him now as a writer, as a consultant. He's written several books, which we're going to dig into here. But I mentioned to Peter before the show, kind of the reason I threw out I call it a Hail Mary email to see if I get a response. But we've been reading his book, Collaborative Leadership, which is one of his best-selling books here in our district. And our administrative team and our instructional coaches have just been loving what you have to share or what you wrote about. And I just can't wait to kind of pick your brain and dig deeper a little bit in that book and some of your other books. But before we dig in, maybe to share a little bit. People know you kind of as the writer, the blogger, the consultant, kind of doing all things all over the United States, if not the world. But maybe tell us a little bit about your educational journey. How did you get to where you're at today?
Oh Lord, I don't even know how to answer that. If people know me, they probably know the fact that my educational journey was not what you would have thought it would be. I'm the youngest of five. I was retained when I was in fourth grade. My dad actually passed when I was in fifth grade, and my mom went back to get her GED when I was in sixth grade. And I actually struggled throughout school. I graduated fourth from last in my class, so there are 266 kids in my class, and I was ranked 262. But I had some long distance running coaches that were really great role models for me. And then I had failed out of two community colleges. It all just seems like a blur now. But on the third community college, I had this really great coach who said, DeWitt, you're not going to be a professional runner. I really need you to, go into the Learning Assistance Center. And I was 21 and I went into the Learning Assistance Center with a 1.7 GPA. And I walked out that semester with a 3.86, went to nationals for cross country, junior college. But after that, things changed. But it was really interesting because for so long, I graduated with my bachelor's when I was 24. And then I got my master's probably, I think I finished right before my 30th birthday. And then I became a principal at 35. And I remember people starting to say, well, you're young for a principal. And I was like, how did that happen? I used to, like, I was always the kid that was older than everybody else in the grade level because I was retained. I was, the kid that was older because I was 21 when I started my 2-year degree. And then all of a sudden, I went back, got my doctorate, finished when I was 40. People are like, wow, you're young to have a doctorate. And I'm thinking, like, life just completely changed that way. So my educational journey is probably a little bit different than people may expect, especially when they know I write books and all of that kind of stuff too.
So, okay. So teacher, K through what did you teach when you taught?
I taught first grade for 7 years. I taught second grade for 3 years, and I taught third grade for 1 year. And it was first grade was not a grade that I ever thought I would want to teach. I actually had this amazing student teaching experience with this guy named Dave Kazansnak, who I'm still friends with to this day. He was like my role model, somebody I wanted to emulate. And I remember just thinking I really wanted to teach fourth grade. But, it's funny when you put yourself through college and you have student loans and somebody hires you and says you're going to teach first grade and they're going to pay you, you're like, hey, you know what? First grade's not so bad after all. And it honestly became one of the greatest experiences that I ever had teaching first grade because it's just really interesting when you're trying to teach 30 first graders, and you might have a teacher's aide for 45 minutes to an hour, but you learn a lot about classroom management and instructional strategies and student engagement. You learn a lot about that kind of stuff. But I also learned that back then, I think I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder. Just from the experiences I grew up with, I kind of thought nobody else experienced what I did. And when you start teaching a high poverty city school, you start to learn that kids have it a whole lot tougher than you did. And so for me, there was a lot of growth, not just from a teaching standpoint, but also from the emotional, like social emotional standpoint, maturity standpoint too. And I'll never regret the 11 years that I taught, because I can officiate weddings. So you talk about how I can do everything, but I actually got certified to officiate weddings because my nephew and his wife were getting married a few years ago. But two of my former first graders that I taught actually reached out to me and said, "Will you come and officiate our wedding?" I'm like, wow, I never thought I'd be doing that, officiating the wedding of two of my former first graders when I was a teacher. It was just, so it's just, for me, it's been a phenomenal experience. Just, I've been very blessed. Since I became a teacher to where I am today, I'm very blessed with it.
So 11 years as a teacher, and then eight years as a principal, correct?
Yeah, so technically it was 7.5, but I usually round up because I took a leave of absence. So I went directly from teaching the high poverty school to being a principal in a rural suburban school outside of Albany. And it was, once again, just, I found myself, I loved my staff. Like, they chose me. I mean, I interviewed in front of a panel of 17 people, and I ultimately got chosen for the job. And we went through hard times, but it was just, I loved being a building principal. I never really wanted to do anything else other than that from then on, was be a building principal. But then I had written a book for my publisher based on my doctoral work. And then I was writing the blog, and then John Hattie sort of found me, and somebody he worked with, her name is Deb Masters, and they found me, and they, got me to come to California to start doing some, to see if I wanted to train to be a consultant. And quite honestly, I walked out after that week, and before when some of the people there said, we'd like you to leave your job to become a consultant, I actually said no. Like, I'm happy being a principal, I'm good. And then after I left California, I come back to New York State, and I'm getting ready to start the new school year. And I just kept thinking, it's, I wonder. So I took a leave of absence, but it didn't start until December of that year. So it was December of 2013. And that's when I went back. I went to California twice to do trainings with people from John's group. And then, a few months later, John invited me to New Zealand, where I spent 10 days with him. And then like a month after that, I was in Europe, and I remember just standing in Europe going, I don't think I'm going back to being a principal. And I ended up resigning a few months later.
Okay, so I definitely want to dig into some of the research and the writing.
Yeah, sure.
But let's back up real quick to your principal days, okay? Because the audience for this show is mostly current administrators, principals, superintendents, aspiring administrators. Take us back maybe to the first year, Peter Dewitt, principal. What are some of the best decisions you made? What are maybe some of the questionable decisions you made that first year as a principal? Anything that sticks out?
Well, I don't think I ever make questionable decisions, but no. Yeah, you know what? One thing that I ended up doing really well, and I was very lucky, because the person I was taking over for became the assistant superintendent. I wrote about this in Collaborative Leadership. So she became the assistant superintendent, and so I got hired in April of that year, April of 2006. And she said, listen, you can come over whenever you want, but I was still teaching. So one of the things that I did is, one night a week, I left my job as a teacher. We finished at like 3:30 or whatever. I drove a half an hour over to Averill Park, where I was going to be a principal. And I got to know the kids like that were in the after school program, or the teachers that were staying late, or Sharon was really fantastic, like taking me around the building and all that stuff. And so once a week, I actually went over there, and then I took 2 personal days and got to know the kids. They even set it up like we had this advisory group thing. And I spent the day with the kids in different classrooms, and then they had a special parent night and all that stuff. So by the time I actually started officially in July, I knew most of them already. In fact, the person who was was going to become my secretary gave me a yearbook and just said, listen, you can try to get to know the kids' names. I know their faces change and all that stuff, but she said the teachers are in there. She wrote their spouse's name next to their name, and I studied it. I actually came home and studied it, and because I was so, like, one of the things that I think has been different about my experience is that I am the first in my family to go to college, and there was this huge sense of pride when I became a teacher. Like, my mom introduced me and she's like, this is my youngest son, Peter, and he's a teacher. And in fact, she would call me the baby because that's what I am, I guess. But when I became a principal, it was like, wow, my brother's a principal and that kind of stuff. So there's always a sense of pride. So for me, like, this extra stuff that I was doing that people allowed me to do was awesome, because I just felt so honored to be in the role. And I know that that might sound silly to people. I don't think people take the principalship for the value that they should. They kind of look at it as the next stepping stone or whatever, or they deserve to have it. I really looked at it like I was honestly very honored to be a part of it. And the teachers that I worked with, who, many I still talk to this day, luckily through social media, and the former students I had, I always, it was a great, one of the things that I felt like is doing that pre-work that we were just talking about really set me up to really show that I cared about being there. Like, doing that extra made people feel like I didn't just look at this as it's a job and you're gonna, bow down to me because I'm the principal and all that stuff. They really looked at it as, okay, this guy really actually cares about getting to know us. So that would be something that I did. I think from a challenging standpoint, there were times that I made decisions early on, especially, and I wouldn't say with my teachers, because my teachers were pretty outspoken. So if I made a decision, I would know about it. But I would say with parents, like, I moved the parent pickup door because it was unsafe where it was. Kids would run out in front of a bus and stuff. And I thought, what, this probably isn't a good idea. So I found that I made some of those changes without really consulting the parents. And that's when I actually started blogging. I started blogging way back in like 2007, 2008, because I had heard about this blogging thing. It was brand new. And what I realized is that I could no longer make these decisions in a bubble or a vacuum. I needed to at least not only talk about them at PTA, but also be able to address why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that's really when I started to get into blogging. So I would say that I'm a pretty sensitive and sentimental guy. And one of the things that I always felt, and maybe it's the elementary person in me, if I made bad decisions, I always apologized for it. Like, I would send emails. I mean, I definitely made mistakes with my staff, but I would just follow up and send an email and say, I'm really sorry that I did that. I made a rash decision, or I made a decision without talking to enough of you about your input, or something like that. I don't remember any big, I didn't make any big, terrible decisions, but anyone that I could tell, sort of hurt the school climate a little bit, I definitely came back to apologize. That's why I was always a fan of Stephen Covey's work, because I would talk to my staff and say, sometimes you make withdrawals, other times you make deposits. And I try my best to make deposits, but sometimes to make withdrawals. And when I do that, and it's unnecessary as opposed to unavoidable, when it's unnecessary and I do that, I need to apologize. So I hope that answers the question.
No, you gave some good positives that happened with the pre, getting ready for the job. And then just kind of making you're right with parents. Sometimes you don't, you think I got to get buy-in from staff making a decision, but sometimes you don't think about parents. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. So you talked a little bit about the writing and consulting. Let's talk about your first book. So your first book was Dignity for All. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it was actually, I'm going to read kind of just the one-liner here. It's focused on fostering a more caring school culture for focused on LGBT students, which has become, kind of a really hot topic these last couple of years, I feel like.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I feel like you were ahead of your time when you wrote that back in whatever it was, 12 or 11, when you wrote that. So maybe give us the biggest advice from that book. And I wrote down, and has anything changed in your mind since you wrote that 8 or 9 years ago?
No, sadly, not a lot has changed. It's funny you say that you thought I was ahead of the game. I actually thought I was like way behind the game. So that was actually the focus of my doctoral dissertation, and my doctoral chair, Jim Butterworth, another person who was a great mentor to me. When we were talking about what is going to be my focus, he knew that I was very passionate about social justice. And he said, "What about LGBT students?" And I was like, "Really? Is that a thing? Like, should I really be like, is that an issue that I should?" Because I was in a very inclusive school environment. Like the school district that I was working in was very inclusive. So it just was not, I think I just got so used to that bubble that I didn't see it as an issue. And then what happened is we our school district had low enrollment, budget cuts, so we ended up closing a one classroom per grade level school, and I absorbed the whole population. And a parent from that school created a hate blog, and she used to target the administrators who were gay and that kind of stuff. And that's really when I started to say, oh wow, like I'm an adult with, I'm getting my doctorate. What's it like to be a 14-year-old kid who doesn't have that kind of experience? So I realized then, it's funny how some of these opportunities come up. I realized then that it was an issue that I needed to address. And I even got pushback from the university where I was doing my doctorate. They were uncomfortable with the subject matter. And I was the first person to be called in front of the institutional review board. And I just remember, like, it's just bizarre. Like, why are we're schools. We're supposed to be talking about these things. It's what's happening in society. Like, we can ignore it as much as we want, but it's there. And then I had been talking to an editor from Corwin, Arnis Burbakovs, for a couple of years. And I was struggling with, like, he wanted me to write a book. And I was like, I don't know if I have it in me. I don't know what I could do. And I had been writing articles. And he said, "So what was your dissertation on?" And I told him, and he said, "I think you just found your first book." And it was honestly the first book Corwin ever published on the topic. Over the years, much to your question about have things changed, I don't think so. I think that, I live in upstate New York. People think New York State's very liberal. But the reality is I've been called names, walking down the street. I just actually wrote an article for Ed Leadership that just appeared in Ed Leadership for the December, January issue on what it's like to be openly gay as a teacher and a principal and all that stuff. So still there's a little bit of fear, like, even 9 years after writing the book, you're kind of like, you worry about the backlash. I've received hate mail, through emails and stuff from people who didn't like the blog topics. It's been really interesting. Like, I remember early on with the blog, I honestly, over about a year and a half period, I wrote maybe 3 blogs on safeguarding LGBT students and what it looks like. And I got pushback from people saying, "Why do you talk about this all the time?" I literally I remember I presented at a conference in Las Vegas, and somebody put on the evaluation. And I honestly, in an hour and a half, I spoke for 2 minutes on safeguarding LGBT students because I was talking about school climate and I was talking about marginalized populations. I had somebody who actually wrote on the evaluation, "I couldn't wait to see Peter Dewitt because I love his writing, but then he got on his soapbox about gay students and I had to walk out." And I was like, "Wow, you walked out and did the evaluation. Thank you for that." So, like, over the years, I've seen progress in people who communicate with me and ask me questions, and that's been really great. But other times, no, I still think that there are people that, I still know that there are students and teachers and administrators who are gay who cannot be out because the school climate is very hostile. The school district might be very hostile. So, I'd like to say that the book helps, and I definitely hear from people. I actually got a tweet a while ago from somebody in New Zealand that said, like, it was their favorite book and stuff, but it was sad to me that it's still relevant. I know that sounds really strange coming from the author of the book, but it's strange. But to me, it's actually a little sad that 9 years later, it's still a relevant book. So.
Um, so a lot of school districts, whether it's all kinds of different cultural issues that are kind of coming up these last couple of years, leaders don't know where to start. They don't know, they're uneasy about it. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to. It's just kind of a tricky place for school leaders to be at these days. I feel like, what recommendation, if they want to open that conversation, or you talked about how, some more liberal districts are open and they're inclusive with the populations, here in the Midwest, that's not always the case.
Right, for sure.
What, if people are wondering, where should I start? What should I do? Do you have, I know that's kind of a tricky question, but do you have any advice for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are definitely a few places to start, like, which is a book I wrote years ago. I talked about enabling conditions. Like, you know what? Do a check out your school and look in your library, look at the images that you've got, look at the topics that are discussed in school. Are they representative of your whole school population? And I get that leaders are uncomfortable, but you know what? That doesn't really bode well with me for too much longer, because leaders are actually in a position of leadership, which means that sometimes you've got to go up against the grain. And believe me, I get it. I didn't always like confrontation either, but sometimes, in order to stick up for kids, you have to, because if you don't, then the reality is you're just saying, okay, it's good for me to just have a population of my students that are going to be abused and bullied. I don't think that's fair. So from as far as a starting point goes, I think that you need to be able to have conversations with your school leadership teams and talk about, what could this look like? What are things that we can do within our school? Because you're right, much the way you're saying, there's a different starting point for everybody. For me, it was always, from when I was a teacher on to when I was a principal, it was about making sure that I had books that were representative of the populations that I had. So I worked in very diverse schools as a teacher. I always made sure that the books were a positive representation of those cultures and races that were in the school. But it's more than that too. It's about understanding the perspective that they're coming from. Sometimes the starting point is just something as simple as putting up a safe space sticker so kids understand. They might not be out. The reality is, I wrote the book on Dignity for All because I was doing research and kids are coming out at a really young age. And like, we want to give them a space where they're going to feel welcome and nurtured, because sometimes they don't even get that at their own home. So it might be something like, paying attention to GLSEN, which used to be called the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. Now it's just called the acronym GLSEN. But looking at safe space stickers, giving kids an understanding that even if they're not out, there is a safe place for them to be able to go. Sometimes it's about creating the opportunity for a GSA. State law usually shows that if a student wants to start a gay straight alliance, then they have the right to be able to do that, and school leaders have to abide by that. So sometimes it's just giving that kind of space. It doesn't mean that you have to wear your rainbow flag wherever you go. It means that you're giving people a space that they're going to feel comfortable, and doing that through safe space or having a committee or creating a GSA or something like that is also a really great place to start.
Okay. I appreciate you sharing that with me.
Yeah, no problem.
Let's kind of shift gears a little bit. You and I talked a little bit before the show. Like, your books do a great job. You embed so much great research in your books. And you don't always see that. You see that in some education books, but not all. So maybe talk about that. And I love the research. Why do you choose to include? You do a great job of maybe telling a story, coming back to research, giving an anecdote, coming back to research. Why did you choose to do that? And why do you think a lot of other education books or authors don't do that?
Yeah, I think it's a problem that they don't. I'll be very honest with you. When I wrote Dignity for All, there was research in there because I wanted it. you need to understand that when I'm writing a book, I approach it as a learning experience. I don't just write it like Peter Dewitt wants everybody to know, right? I'm writing and learning at the same time. That's probably, I mean, if I wasn't learning at the same time, I probably wouldn't write any books whatsoever. So Dignity for All definitely had some research in there because I had used the research I had to do during my doctoral work. But then, I did some practical books, but the problem I have, I guess, is that I always want to honor the people that came before me. And I never want people to think that I'm saying I created all this. Even with collaborative leadership, I did not create collaborative leadership. What I am doing is I am taking the collaborative leadership research and I'm trying to give it an understanding, because most of the people that I read, most of the researchers did not have a building level experience like I did. So I'm trying to look at it and say, does this research actually match up with what you can do in a building? So the challenge is to make sure that you're focusing on research, but finding a balance and providing actionable steps as well. Because if you're only focusing on research, then you're going to lose readers. But if you're only focusing on practice, I think that sometimes you're missing the boat too, because there's a lot of great research that's out there. Now, you and I both know I have a luxury. I'm close with John Hattie. I started out by doing his work. So he introduced me to he introduced me to more research than I ever knew existed. There are two people that I thank quite often for sort of my evolution with research. One is John Hattie, the other one is Jenny Donahue, and Jenny's out of Ontario in Canada, and she is just actually, believe it or not, I'm in the middle of writing a book, so I'm citing some of her work. They have introduced me to so much research that I find it very fascinating. I want to go through it. I want to see, because you never want to offer up something that research says actually doesn't work, right? So if you're writing a book and you're doing it on practice, and yet there's a lot of research out there that says that doesn't actually work, then you're really doing a disservice to the people that are reading your books. Just because something worked for me when I was a school principal doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody else. So instead of just offering practice, and this is what I've learned, I want to be able to actually be able to say, and this is what research says about it as well, because I think that that's very important. As far as all of that goes, over the years, I have been sort of introduced to so much that it has been this great learning experience that I feel like, especially in the United States, I feel like in the US, we know a lot of the same people, a lot of the same researchers, and we go back to that well. And working with somebody like John or Jenny Donahue, and then, I do a lot of international work over the past few years. You're introduced to researchers from around the world that you may not have heard about before. And I think that that's entirely important too, because we need to understand the different perspectives. Why people don't necessarily, I'm probably going to have an unpopular answer. There are some times that I think people don't put a lot of research in their book because they just don't care to read it. They just don't care to look for it. They think that they can sit at Starbucks and they're going to write a book and, they're going to be able to put it out, because sometimes publishers will tell you that's what sells. And that's the truth. People are going to look for a lot of practice that maybe wasn't research based, and that's what a publisher is looking for. And hey, if people want to read it, that's go for it. Other times they don't put research in it because of the fact that they're worried it's not going to sell. Because if you have too much research, then they're going to look at it like, is this a university book, and am I going to be bored with philosophy? I want to know, I want to know practice. I don't want to just know philosophy. And other times people don't put research in there because I think, sadly, there's pressure sometimes to make it seem like it is your own idea, that you created it all. And that's just not true. When I read about collaborative leadership, it was completely influenced by other people. In fact, I used 6 of John's influences, Hattie's influences, because at that time I was a visible learning trainer, and I had been writing blogs on John's work and taking his work and breaking it down to 1,000, 1,100 words or less. And John loved that because I made it very practical. So when I'm running workshops and I still have my leadership mindset, I'm looking at his 251 influences and saying, much to the question you had for me earlier, where do you start? And that's exactly what was on my mind. And that's where the 6 influences came from. And I wanted to be able to make teachers, students, families. I wanted to be able to, cover the gambit there. Other times when I'm writing about, instructional leadership, which came out last year, I have been doing a tremendous amount of research around what is instructional leadership supposed to look like. Like Edmund started looking at instructional leadership back in 1979, but it's 2021 and we're still hearing about people that don't know how to practice instructional leadership. How can that be possible, right? It's been 42 years. So part of what you do is you look at all the research and say, okay, what am I offering here that's going to be different? Like in instructional leadership, I expanded the view because people used to look at instructional leadership as just building level leaders. And I needed to look and say, no, it's more than that. It's teacher leaders, it's PLC leads, it's instructional coaches. They need to have instructional leadership too. So that's where I might be writing about a topic that most people have heard, but I was actually looking at it from a very different perspective because nobody had talked about how teacher leaders, instructional coaches, they were going to be instructional leaders as well. And I also, part of the research I was looking at, and I was looking at a lot of international research, is that people were saying things like, well, instructional leadership is only a small piece of the puzzle. Well, I started to look and say, okay, that's good. I understand that. But if you get that small piece of the puzzle wrong in your teacher observation or your walkthroughs, you're screwed because you're going to ruin your school climate. You're going to hurt that. And then researchers are saying it's a black box. We don't really know. We know it has an impact, but we're not sure why. And I was like, I wonder why that is. And I broke it down into 6 different pieces, which are implementation. I'm looking for a focus on learning. What do we look for when we go into a classroom? So much to your question about that whole research and practice piece, what I want to be able to do is honor the researchers that came before because there is a plethora of it and we should acknowledge it. We should be able to talk about it. We should be able to focus on it. But also from a practice standpoint, I'm always sitting here, and I guess the luxury for me is I run workshops. I coach school leaders from K to 12. I teach at the university level as like an adjunct or in special circumstances. I'm always looking at it like, what is this going to look like from their perspective? And so that's another reason why I do it. I realize that's a huge answer that probably gave you too much information, but I wish more people did incorporate research into the books that they're writing, because what we know now is that it's not just good enough to have the opinion. It's not good enough to just have an opinion. It means that you really need to make sure that if you are offering something up to readers to say, this is what I believe, then I want to be able to have research to back it up. Because if not, I'm doing my readers a disservice.
Well, our team is definitely a fan of that the back and forth, the embedding you have of the research that goes in your, at least in collaborative leadership. We love it. Gives us more confidence to go down a path of trying out some of what you've recommended, knowing that you have that data to back it up. You probably gave me like 5 or 6 different directions I could go, because there's like, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that. I'm just curious. You talked about walkthroughs a couple of times. I'm going off script here a little bit. If Peter Dewitt is walking into a classroom tomorrow to do a 5-minute walkthrough, what is he doing? What is he doing with that time? What feedback is he giving? Just share that with us.
So it's funny you ask that. And you know what I love is that you've asked me questions that I've never been asked before in podcasts. So this is really great. Like I've never been asked about the research in the book thing. What I like, so this is what I can tell you. I coach school leaders. I coach school teams, middle school and high school in California, 2 days a month. And right now it's all remote. But when we're together in person, we always did walkthroughs together, because my question is, and it's what I wrote about in instructional leadership as well, when you go into a classroom, what do you look for? Because I want to create that common understanding together. And it's not because I always know the answer. It's because I want to sit there and say, what do we look for? So over time, my answer to your question has evolved, because what I look for when I'm going in is I will look for moments of teacher clarity. Like, are teachers being very clear in the learning intentions and the success criteria about the learning piece, right? And that should be short. Even I've surveyed kids, so you should have, if you're going to offer teacher clarity and that stuff, it should be 10 minutes or less. I want to see many times, I want to see collaboration. But when I'm coming in to see student collaboration, there's some really great research out of the UK. You mentioned research. Rob Coe out of the UK actually did research that showed 80% of the time the kids are in our classroom, they're doing collaborative, they're in a collaborative group. But 75% of that time, they're actually engaged in individual learning. So we're really good at collaborative seating. We're not so good at collaborative learning. So when I'm going into a classroom, it's going to depend on what we're talking about. So if I go in and I see direct instruction, then part of me, I'm going to be looking to say, okay, where's the teacher clarity? Where are the intention success criteria with this direct instruction? Because direct instruction is appropriate. It's just, why are we doing it right now? And what does it look like? And how are the kids engaged? That kind of stuff. If I walk into a classroom and it happens to be kids are sitting around tables and they're in a cooperative group, then I'm going to walk in, still going to look for teacher clarity, still going to look for learning intention, success criteria. How do kids know that they're going to be successful? But I'm also going to look to say, how are the kids engaged in the conversation that they're having? Other times when I'm going into classrooms, I listen for teacher talk. And that's only because Janet Clinton, who's at the University of Melbourne, has done over a decade's worth of research to show that on average, teachers ask 200 questions per day and students ask 2 questions per student per week. And the problem with that, and Sophie Murphy is the name of one of her doctoral students, Sophie actually found that that's okay for your accelerated students, your students that are not struggling, because they can listen to the words you're saying and they can tune in and tune out, and they can, if you're going to repeat something, then they're going to know that, you know, this is going to be on the test, or this is something I need to pay attention to. Your struggling learners wish you would stop talking. They want to be able to talk to their peer because their peer is going to use it in the language they understand. So sometimes I'm walking into classrooms and listen to teacher talk versus student talk. Like, is the teacher dominating the conversation? Like, I'm going to look for those kind of things when I'm walking in. The cool thing right now that I'm doing with a lot of leaders is we're actually doing remote walkthroughs. So I devised this way with the teams that I've been working with, because I'm here, they're in California. We want to be able to go in, like, I don't care what people say. We want to see how kids are being engaged right now. We are still school. We need to understand Maslow and Bloom. I get that. We have to understand all that. But if we're going to come together, we still have to focus on learning, right? So what does that look like? And what are the challenges of doing that? Like, it's supposed to be for me, it's always about a non-judgmental stance. So right now we're doing remote walkthroughs where we've got a team, there are 5 or 6 of us. The teacher knows we're coming in, but it's only the principal that they see comes in, because the principal shares their screen. I always ask them to keep the comment section open so I can see what the teachers are doing or what the students are talking about. And then we've got our comment box open. We're talking in real time about what we see in the classroom. And the cool thing about that from a school leadership team perspective, it's developing that common language and common understanding. So that's how I approach a lot about walkthroughs. The question that I definitely want to address too is when you said feedback. I think we have to let ourselves off the hook and say, am I supposed to be giving feedback every time I walk into a classroom? Because that's ridiculous. Like, as a school principal, I went into classrooms every single morning to say good morning to the kids. And I walked back in during the day because I wanted to see what they were learning. But it didn't mean I was always going to give feedback to my teachers. And I think it's ridiculous if we put that kind of stressor on principals. I think if you're going to spend 10 minutes or more in a classroom, I'll give feedback form for the book that I'm working on, which is something I've always avoided, but I feel like let's get it sketched out. If you're in there for 5 minutes and you're really just in there because you want to spend time getting to know the kids, then you don't need to be giving feedback to teachers. Like, it's ridiculous to think that every time we walk into a classroom, there's this pressure that, oh, we're supposed to give feedback. And the other thing about that is any feedback we're going to get, especially when it comes to a learning walk, is that we better have, like the learning walk form that I'm creating, we better have taken teacher voice into consideration, because if I'm developing a feedback form and that I'm using the feedback form, then what that means is learning walks are done to teachers, not done with them. And so if a principal is going to do this whole learning walk and feedback thing, then they need to make sure that they're actually talking to their teachers and getting teacher input about that process and what it should look like. But I never think that every time you walk into a classroom, you're supposed to be giving feedback. Just, I can't even fathom the idea of that happening every time.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, your thoughts on walkthroughs there. I know it just seems like that's always a discussion with administrative teams, with teacher leaders, with even teachers about what those should look like. And there's so many different theories and templates and just all kinds of different things that people use. So I appreciate you sharing from your perspective there.
That's a hot button, if you can tell, that's a hot button issue for me, because I do. Like a long time ago, I started working with instructional coaches and they were going in doing check boxes and everything to teachers. I'm like, could you imagine what that's like to be a teacher and see you come in? What if you don't even have credibility to do it? Like, what if you're walking into my room and I don't even think you're a credible source to give me feedback? So like, unless you're developing all of that with your teachers, you shouldn't be like, you're just going to create some chaos within your school climate.
Okay. I like that. That's definitely something I can't say with confidence that we've done in the past. So that's a really great point. You're giving some great answers here. I got to speed it up a little bit here.
Well, I've never been asked these questions, so now you're like, I'm like, it's after 6 o'clock here. I'm ready to go.
Well, okay. So collaborative leadership, I feel like I did kind of a book summary of your book, and I had like 25 takeaways. I only picked one, and I don't know if I'm super happy with the takeaway I picked, but we're going to go with it. So
Okay.
your quote was, most school districts spend approximately 85% of their entire budget on human resources. It is astonishing that more emphasis is not placed on developing the human capital of a district's largest investment. So what did you mean when you said that?
I feel like, and maybe we're learning it during COVID, I feel like we're always hiring people and then boom, you're on your own. Even as a principal, I was very lucky, but I was still handed the keys, and I had this great get to know everybody and all that stuff. But still in September, when the school year started, I'm like, am I really prepared for this? Like, am I the guy? Am I sure I should be doing this? And I just feel like it's hard for me sometimes, because I feel like teachers get hired, they're put in the classroom, and if they struggle, they're almost criticized or demonized for it. Or if they disagree with the principal, like I do remember some admin meetings where some of the teachers were demonized. I never spoke negatively about my teachers at a K-12 admin meeting, because here's the reality. The other people around the table don't know my teachers. Do I really want them to think they're negative, or, oh, Peter's got such a tough job because those teachers, like, I just think some of that stuff's ridiculous. So I think what I was going with, and you're talking about a book that I wrote 5 years ago. So, what I always feel our job is, and that's why collaborative leadership was why I chose those two words, collaborative leadership. I feel like we need to look at the human aspect of what we do, and we need to look at it a lot more. I was a better leader because of my teachers and because of the students and because of the parents, but mostly because of the teachers. I was a better principal, and we need to invest in that. We can't just hire them and, oh, they're bad, so suddenly, or they disagree with me, so suddenly I don't want them anymore. No, we bring them in, and we should be fostering all of this growth together. We are in a human business. In fact, Albert Bandura, who writes a lot about self-efficacy. I really do have these books next to me, not just because of you. Um, you know, it comes from this idea that we learn in a social context. School is about learning in a social context. So we need to have a human way to learn in a social context with people within our school that we have hired, or maybe we have, um, we, we got because we were the principal and they were already there or whatever. And we need to learn how to figure that out and come together despite that we might have, different ideas and diverse opinions and all that stuff. And I think that's where I'm coming from when I wrote that.
So I lied. I actually got one more question from that kind of stemmed from collaborative leadership, but I
Sure.
feel like this is a more universal thing.
Yeah, yeah.
You are known for saying, or you said, we should look at between school. Oh, instead of looking at between schools variability,
Yeah.
we should look at within schools variability, which I thought was great. I loved hearing that. What, explain what that meant. What did you
I'm
mean?
glad you think that's great, but that's actually not me. So, I mean, I did write about that. So I don't want you to think that
Okay.
I already picked on you about Albany. I don't want to pick on you.
I learned my lesson there. I learned my
No, sorry. No, so that was always, that was something that John, we used to talk about invisible learning all the time, because what he said is, we spend a lot of time comparing schools. We need to, my elementary school to your elementary school to whatever. And he said, really what you have to be able to do is actually look at within the school variability, because that's where you really can have the most control. So within your school as a school principal, you've got teachers that are probably really, really good, right? They're highly impactful. And then you've got teachers that are not as impactful. And that's what you really have to be able to look at, because not only is that the thing that's in your sphere of influence, but that's where you're going to get the greatest bang for your buck. Comparing my school to another school is not going to be helpful. Me making sure that I'm looking at that within school variability, that's where I, as a building leader, will get the biggest bang for my buck. So does that make sense when I
Yep,
say it that way?
for sure.
Yeah, that was a John thing that I actually loved. Like I remember when he first said that, and I just gravitated to that piece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've, I think a couple different places, you've been a huge advocate for school leaders using social media.
Mm.
And I love your definition. I talk about stealing people's stuff. I actually steal. I think I gave you credit. I meant to remember. I can't remember the tweet exactly. But I love like your definition of why leaders need to use social media. But maybe share your own words there that I've
Yeah,
probably stolen.
yeah.
That
Because
I've
I've
probably
evolved.
stolen.
I've definitely evolved since then. Listen, social media has been fantastic for me. I got on Twitter when I started writing the blog and, the Finding Common Ground blog for Ed Week back in 2011. I didn't know anything about Twitter, but I connected with so many people within the community. I have so many friends that, like, it's awkward when you go to a workshop and you realize, have I actually met this person before? Or do I just talk to them so much? I mean, I remember like early on seeing people at conferences and they ran up and hugged me and were like hugging because we're meeting each other for the first time. And then when you really think about it, it's a little odd because you've only talked to this person through like 140 characters at that time, right? So like it's this odd thing, but the connections I've made, I mean, social media is something that has been such a great connection for me. And I think I've had to evolve through it because back then when I started to do it, it was about, let me share my blog, right? And it was very self-serving. Let me use this to share my blog so people are going to read it. Then over time, what I realized is that it was a place where I could actually communicate with people. Like we would engage in dialogue that way. Maybe we would start off by tweeting to each other, and then it would turn into a private message that would then turn into an email that would then turn into a phone call. But it was a really great place to connect. And so there was that element that I think is very powerful. From a consulting standpoint, there's always a lot of pressure. People are tweeting out that they're going to see you or that you're speaking, or that they're at a workshop for you, they want to do selfies and stuff. And I think that's all fine and good. It really is. Like, I love meeting people, especially people who read the books or, I've talked to and that stuff. But sometimes I worry about the self-serving part of it, that I think I still continue. It's definitely an evolution. Like, I see people tweeting out their own quotations, and I have been guilty of doing that from like when collaborative leadership came out. But over the past 4 years, I've kind of looked at that saying, should I really be like creating a PowerPoint slide of my own quotation and tweeting it out? Like, there's almost something obnoxious about that, right? So for me, I do appreciate social media. I think we're all very accessible, and I think that's cool. The one area that I would say, and I wrote a blog about this probably a year ago, and I definitely got some pushback on it, was that the one thing I don't do is I don't debate on social media. Whether it be Facebook, whether it be Twitter, if I just don't debate. And I actually wrote a blog why I don't debate on Twitter. And the reason why is because, number one, I'm just not very good at it. And number two is that I don't think it's the place where it's not a place where I feel comfortable debating, because I feel like there's so much left out. The body language, the opportunity to connect. I feel like sometimes it can create more of a challenge. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. So I know that when I wrote Collaborative Leadership, I was all over social media, and believe me, I do love it. Like, it's been a great connection. It's been a really great way to meet people. But sometimes I worry about the self-serving part of it. And I only say that because I'm concerned about myself, not that I'm judging others when I say that. It's just, it's like the selfie generation. I think at some point you have to, you kind of say, oh, wow, like, there are a lot of selfies here. What am I doing as far as humanity goes? I don't know if that makes sense, but
makes sense. Yeah. I pulled up the tweet here that I shared some of our statistics about social media. We've got we really push on social media a lot in our district.
Yeah.
And I used you listed 3 reasons why social media is important: communication, public relations, and branding. And so as a district, because I do feel like, we're passionate about our social media. We share a lot more than most districts. We like getting the word out there, and people are like, well, what does it matter?
Yeah.
And I just feel like when I read that, just like, well, we're communicating, we're working on public relations, and we're branding our district. To me, that was like, yes, I love those 3 words side by side, or those 4 words. And it just makes sense.
I think it's important to say there are some people that will actually do a much better job of talking about that very topic than I do. Like, I think of Joe Sanfilippo and Tony Saninas or Eric Scheninger. I think about those were sort of the early people that I mean, because Tony and Joe I created the Connected Educator series for Corwin 6 or 7 years ago, and they wrote The Power of Branding. So I think I cited them in there too, because that's something that I think they do very well. For me, from a school district standpoint, I think it makes you, yes, the branding piece I get is important, but I think that's where I probably would evolve too over the past few years since writing Collaborative Leadership, is that, to me, social media isn't just about branding. It's about the fact that you're welcoming people in. You're using it as a communication tool. Like, I remember I did research around communication, and I found, and I wrote about this in a leadership coaching book, that there are really 3 ways we communicate. Schools will communicate through like important information, right? Like, it's one-sided. Here are important dates and times. Here's Title IX, those kind of things that you need to know. The second one is communication that's going to engage in dialogue. So what I started to do when I was a principal is I flipped my communication. Like, I would create videos, 5-minute videos, and send them out to parents and families, like before open house, and say, we're going to talk about the Dignity for All Students Act or the Common Core. Come to open house so we can talk more about like what bullying is and what it's not. So in that case, social media became a case for me to open up dialogue that would happen after. So I flipped the communication, and then they would come and they would say, I read that article, I listened to the video, here's the question I have. So we need to make sure we're using social media to do that we're not just sending out these one-sided messages, that we're sending it out in a way that we're going to be able to engage in dialogue. The third way is about learning. You know, schools are a place of learning. So for me, science fair, makerspace nights, art, exhibits, chorus concerts, all of the plays, those are all like learning pieces, because that's an exhibit of what our students are doing to learn. So those are the three ways most schools communicate. So if we can make sure we're using social media in that standpoint, then I'm absolutely cool with it.
So I've got to sneak in a guest question real quick from your buddy JR over in Clinton. So I texted him last night because you've worked with him, and he's a big fan of yours. And I said, hey, if I can ask Peter a question for you, what would it be? And this is his question. He said, as a principal, you were able to see progress on a daily basis or a weekly basis. In your current role, how do you measure progress?
Yeah, so that was always, that's sort of been the underlying question for me for the past few years, because I think you can go in and give a keynote, you can go in and run a workshop, and boom, you're gone, right? So for me, one of the things that I started doing is I would run competency-based workshops. And what that meant is that, say for 6 influences, collaborative leadership, we would focus on 1 or 2 influences, and then they would have to come back the next time we met, which was typically like a month later, and they would have to bring evidence of the impact. So for me, part of that was the impact I might be having, because if I'm talking about these things and then they're bringing back evidence to show what they're doing in their school, it means that partly the work that I'm doing is having an impact on them. When I'm coaching, that has definitely been something that I'm looking at, because for me, I've been working with the same school district for a while, like one in particular that I'm thinking about. And for me, it's about, I'm looking for the level of impact as far as what we talk about on this day. When I come back and ask you to bring evidence, what does it look like? What are you doing? And it's okay to tell me if you're not doing it, because that's going to be a message to me that maybe what I'm saying, I need to say in a different way, or maybe it's just not working, if that makes sense. So for me, the evidence gathering piece is something that I think is really important. And I ask people to bring that back. And honestly, you have to be open. And I definitely am, because, many times I can look at evaluations, but evaluations tell you how people were feeling that day. They don't tell you how much of an impact your work is having. So when you can do something competency-based and you can ask people to bring long-term and to bringing back evidence, and you're seeing the impact through how they're talking. Like I've got principals that share their whole school emails with me, so I can see the change in the way that they're talking with staff. Those are things that I'm looking at as far as impact. For example, one person that I worked with did a lot of talking about student engagement, but what I mentioned is, so what does that mean? Do you have a common language and common understanding around student engagement? Or you could be talking about authentic engagement, and teachers could be thinking compliant engagement, and you're not talking about that. So let's talk about what does student engagement mean? Seeing that change in the emails that go out, seeing that change in our discussions we're having during coaching sessions is a way that I can tell I'm having impact. But in the same token, you have to be open to, if you are not having impact, what do you need to be able to change about it? And that is pretty much a constant, from a coaching perspective, that's a constant conversation that I'm having, because, and I don't want the people I'm working with to think I'm needy, but I will talk to them and say, so what is it about our conversation that has had an impact on the practice that you're doing within your school? And one of the fortunate things I've had lately is that there have been outside groups that have gone into these school districts because they're doing sort of this whole school review. and the work that I'm doing is coming up as a positive. So that's also kind of a good sign for me. But honestly, to JR's question, I'm still looking for more. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I don't think I'm happy yet with, I think I'm happy with changing conversations. I think I'm happy with the competency-based approach where people are bringing back evidence, but I still feel like maybe it's the researcher side of me. I'm still looking, saying, how do I know? How do we know that what Peter Dewitt is doing is actually having, like, those are good things, and I can see that it's a positive impact, but I still need more. And so it's definitely, I think it's a good question that JR asked, because it's also a good question that we as consultants or coaches or whatever, they have to, they actually keep us honest too, because that is a question that we have to constantly ask ourselves. And those are some of the ways that I'm doing it right now. The other ways, are the simple ways, are surveys. You can look at data as far as, like, I might look at the feedback they give during walkthroughs or feedback they give during teacher observations. Those are ways I can see that I've had an impact, because you can see growth in the language that they're using. So there's definitely a lot of those kind of ways, but I don't think there's ever going to be that one thing that I'm going to say, okay, that's great, I did it. If that makes sense.
Sure. All right. Hey, I promised you an hour. I'm at an hour, and I got about 5 or 6 more quick hitter questions. Are you good if I go through those?
I am.
Okay.
You're in the middle of me and dinner, so I just
Oh
want
no.
to.
Well, shoot.
No, no, it's all good.
6:45 out there on the East Coast.
It's all good. Don't worry.
Okay. So, the show is focused on education, leadership, and personal growth. And this is when we hit kind of the personal growth questions. So these are just like quick hitters. Give me 60 seconds, your quickest answer you got here. Okay.
Sure.
So if somebody, a listener is visiting Albany, what is a place they've got to check out? A restaurant, a place to hang out at? Where do you got to go?
If they're coming to Albany, the Empire State Plaza. Yeah, let me go with that one. It has been always this like futuristic looking place. They've actually shot movies there. So go to the Empire State Plaza. They've got this great venue called the Egg, and it's actually like shaped like an egg. So yeah, go to Empire State Plaza. Really cool place. If you have more time, go upstate, where I actually grew up, to the Adirondacks. You'll never regret that.
All right. You talked about earlier about you are a long distance runner, and I did not write this down ahead of time, but I'm curious. What was your fastest mile?
Oh gosh, my fastest mile was 4:31.
And what is we got, a lot of people listen, like working out. We got New Year's resolutions. What is your one best tip for effective long distance running?
Don't get injured.
Okay.
No, you know what? I was injured for a very long time, but over the past, I bought a road bike that I've been riding, and now I have a Peloton, but I started doing yoga, and I can run again, which is really great. So I would say the best thing you can do from a long distance running standpoint is make sure you stretch, because not stretching made me think that I was injured for the rest of my life and I wasn't going to be able to run. Stretching has made me realize I can run again.
What is one $50 purchase you have made in the last year that has made life easier?
Whoo! $50
or under. $50 or under. It could be $5.
$50 or under that I made that has made my life easier. I honestly, I'm like looking around going, I have no idea if anything has made, you know what has made my life easier? Okay, I made a $50 purchase. It was the Calm app. Calm, I actually do meditation every morning. It's probably $60, so I might have been cheating.
We'll let you.
I'm not sure, but
it's expensive out there in New York, man.
That's right. So that honestly has been like, for me, I've been practicing meditation for about 2.5 years. So that's something that continually, it does make my life easier, because it clears out the things that I don't need to care about.
Sure. Okay, you are a well-read guy. What is one book, just one, that has greatly influenced your life?
Wow, just one, huh? There are, I'm looking around my office right now.
And if you're listening
Um,
at home, he's got books all over the place.
I do, because I'm, in the middle of writing, so I'm really looking around. I would say the book that I really love, like, I know what it is. Actually, I can tell you that right off the top of my head. In my first year of my school principalship, my predecessor handed me, at the time, it was called 15 Things Great Principals Do Differently from Todd Whitaker. I think he's rewritten it to 18. And honestly, that book, just like at that time, was exactly what I needed. Besides that, I've got things like The Principle by Michael Fullan, or Visible Learning, by John Hattie, or Collective Efficacy by Jenny Donahoe. But I'm just naming more books, even though you told me I could only do one. No, honestly, like back then, I think that was a book for me that just, I was like, okay, I can be the principal I want to be.
So we actually, I don't know if you knew this or not, we actually had Todd on the show last month.
Oh, good. Yeah,
So
Todd has been amazing to me. His wife Beth has been amazing to me. Todd and Beth have been wonderful over the years. Todd was probably one of the first people I interviewed for my blog for Ed Week, and he had said such nice, kind things about that. And then from a leadership perspective, he's been a great mentor over the years.
So if you're listening at home and you haven't checked it out, that's episode 40 with Todd, and we dig into great things, what great principals do differently
That's right.
at,
That's what
at
it is.
length. At length. Um, okay. I mean, you're so successful. Was there ever a job you applied for but did not get?
Yes.
And what did you learn?
I learned how to accept gracefully. Yes, I actually was teaching at an elementary school, and I applied for the reading coordinator position because I helped write the grant for Reading First way back in 2001. I didn't end up getting the job, even though I was one of 4 people who wrote the grant. They hired somebody with a PhD in literacy. And what she didn't realize, because I walked into her office, I introduced myself, honest to God, I walked into her office, introduced myself, and I said, I would really love to learn as much as possible about literacy. And, I know that you're new to the school. So if you ever need help, I've been here for, I think I was there for 2 years, maybe. And I said, I would love to be able to, help you out if you need some help. And I never told her that I didn't get the job, but about a month later, she came to me and she said, I need to talk to you. I was like, sure. And she said, I didn't realize you applied for this job. And I said, yeah, I did. And she said, and yet you came to me and said you would help me out. And I said, of course. I said, just because I didn't get the job doesn't mean I don't want you to be successful. Like, my job isn't to make you worse at your job. Because quite honestly, she had more experience. She had much more, she had a depth of knowledge that I did not have. So yeah, that was the job. That was one job that I did not get. And that was how I reacted to it. I feel like it says more about you when you don't get the job than when you do sometimes.
So you've talked about uh, meditation, Peloton, reading, writing. Do you have a daily routine?
Um, I do, and sometimes it's very monotonous, and I have, because I am a former, long distance runner, so I am a creature of habit for sure. But yeah, I do have a daily routine. Right now, it's kind of hard. You can't separate your office from, you're in your home. So I get up in the morning. I'm actually in the middle of writing a book, so I have been doing a couple of hours of writing and research, and then I'll try to do the Peloton or go for a run or whatever. I have a gym in my house, and then I have work because I'm running webinars quite a bit actually. A lot of my work, because I was on the road all the time through March, and then obviously all of that stuff. So all of my work has transferred over to virtual. So yeah, I have to have a set schedule because I'm doing webinars, I'm doing workshops, and I'm doing leadership coaching, and I'm writing at the same time. And I have a show on Ed Week called A Seat at the Table. So I'm doing all of the behind the scenes. So I definitely have a schedule.
Anything nighttime routine?
Yeah, I'm in bed by 9 o'clock.
Uh-oh.
I'm just not a very exciting person. So we will have dinner and I'm honestly in bed by 9 or 9:30. So I get up early in the morning. I prefer to go to bed early and get up early in the morning. I'm not much of a night hawk.
Okay. Okay. Last question. Well, then one more. One big goal you're currently working on it. Is it the book or is it something else?
No, I would say the book. I'm writing a book on instructional leadership teams and how they can develop collective leader efficacy together. And so far, from what I know, there are no other books on the topic of collective leader efficacy ever written. So I feel a tremendous amount of. I just want to make sure that I am represented at all really right, because there are lots of researchers out there who've done a great job. So I would say from a professional goal, writing that book right now is a huge one. Personal goal is to maintain health. I was also a cross country skier in high school, and I haven't skied in 32 years. So I bought cross country skis, and I go up to Queensbury, which is where I grew up, and I learned I only know how to skate ski. So there's traditional skiing, and there's skate skiing, and there's a wonderful park called Coles Woods. It's in Crandall Park that has lit trails. So I actually have been skiing 10 to 15K per day for 2 days when I'm up there. So from a personal goal, it's really just about having a better work-life balance and getting healthy that way, because I used to be on the road way too much.
Okay. Is there anything else we didn't talk? We talked about a lot.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up that we didn't?
No, I'm good. I want to thank you for the time and everything else.
Yeah, and if people want to connect with you, you've got a website. You've talked about the social media. Where's the best place for them to connect with you at?
I would say the best place for them to connect with me is my website is petermdewitt.com. So they can do that. M is in Michael, so petermdewitt.com. And then Twitter is always a great place to find me too, at Peter M. Dewitt. So they can find me there too.
Awesome. So what's for dinner tonight?
Beyond Burgers. Told you, it's all healthy. I've been trying to cut out. I know this is going to be a terrible thing to say to somebody in the Midwest, but I've tried to cut out beef. So yeah.
It's kind of a big thing right now, kind of cutting out the meat, and it's new solutions too. People are trying some new things out there. So
that's right.
Hey, I appreciate it. Again, I know you are a busy, busy guy. I appreciate you giving up your time. Awesome interview. Great knowledge for us working in the field here. So we appreciate it.
Well, thank you to you and your staff for reading the book too. I appreciate that. So.
All right, man. I'm going to let you go. Have a great night and take care. Okay.
All right. Thank you. You as well.